a lot of times people will say, well, if I didn't track it, didn't count.
That too.
And the truth is, I kind of alluded to this a little bit, but it definitely counts. MyFitnessPal or not, that's happening.
Yeah,
And
people demonize MyFitnessPal.
yeah, like, well, I didn't track it, so it didn't happen. It's like, no, it definitely happened, and it's not helpful to lie to yourself.
Yeah.
It's not a helpful truth because it's not true.
Yeah.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to this week's episode of Conquer the Day. I am your host, Brian Pickowitz.
And I'm your co-host, Lindsay Pickowitz.
And today we're talking about how to lose weight without having to track your food. So we're going to share a very special, we'll say, teaching and training that's going to help you be more intuitive and mindful with your nutrition. And this is a really great podcast, a really great episode for anyone who is trying to be a little less connected to their technology while they're improving their nutrition. Now, we are going to talk about how to approach this in a way that allows you to still be successful, and we're going to show you some different tips and tricks that will make it so that you can decide whether you're in a season where you should still track your food using an app like MyFitnessPal or Weight Watchers or whatever you choose, or you're in that season where you should transition to, let's say, mindful eating. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're going to talk about. But Lindsay, why is this an important podcast? Why are we talking about this today?
Yeah, so at the Fitness Project, we work with a lot of business owners and high-level professionals who also have a family. I say all of that because it really sets the stage for someone who has limited bandwidth. And when you have a lot on your plate, you have a lot going on, tracking can feel like a deterrent from your ability to commit to your goals because you think, well, I just can't even handle another thing on my plate, or this just feels like such a chore, I don't want to do it. So if you're in that spot where you feel like you have limited bandwidth or building the habit of tracking is just proving to be very difficult for you, we want you to know that you can still make progress. Mm-hmm. You can still get healthy. You can still go about losing weight in a productive way. But how do you do it? That's really what we want to share with you because, again, we don't want you to be in that all or nothing place where you're either tracking your food or you're saying screw it and doing nothing. We want to give you that middle ground so you still feel empowered and even excited about the opportunity to make progress, even if you can't, quote unquote, do it perfectly or track everything to a T. So we think there's a really good, healthy middle ground that you can find when it comes to being on track with your nutrition.
And so as we build in, like we said, we want to help you establish whether you're in a season where you should track your food or you're in a season where you should start pivoting to this new method. Before we get there, though, we want to talk about why do we track our food? Why is it important that we have some way of seeing what we're putting into our body, especially if we have a weight loss goal? And so what most people think is tracking is just an app, right? It's an app that tells me how much I ate. But the reason why we track is so that we can actually be successful, right? Because tracking and measuring is the only way to really ensure that we hit our target. If you're in a business, you have to track and measure your profitability, your expenses. You have to track all that. If you want to be successful in sales, you have to track how many people did I reach out to, how many people did we connect with, all that data. If you're tracking your budget, you want to have savings, whatever it is. So the point is, the reason why we track is so we can be successful. But beyond that, what tracking actually does is it allows you to see if you're eating enough calories. So in order to lose weight, we all have to be eating at a calorie deficit. It's the science. It's how it works for you to lose body fat. The caveat to that is tracking allows you to see how much you're intaking. We all have what's called a basal metabolic rate, and that BMR is essentially how many calories we need to eat in order to maintain our body. So you think muscle, bone density, all the energy it requires for you to breathe and have your heart working. These are just the maintenance, right? So when we're tracking, what we're really seeing is, am I below that? Am I hitting it? Am I below it? It's giving me that accurate measure of what I'm putting into my body. Now, I bring this up because it's important to know that your body is doing this tracking anyways. So when you eat, let's say, a cheeseburger and it's 500 calories, MyFitnessPal or no MyFitnessPal, your body is taking that in and using it for energy, Or if the energy is not being used, it's getting stored as first, we'll say glycogen, which is a store of energy that you can use later. And if you don't use that, then it turns into fat, which is a store of energy for the future. The point in sharing that is understanding that no matter whether you use an app or not, your body tracks everything you put into it. Mm-hmm. So when we're using an app like MyFitnessPal, we're taking what is naturally happening inside of our body and we're essentially externalizing it. Mm-hmm. We're giving ourselves a way to see it, because whether or not you tracked it doesn't matter. Your body is still ingesting those amount of calories, all that food, and it's either going to lead you to hit your goal or not. And so tracking is really just a tool that we use.
Yeah, and I think that was very well said. That's why we track. And a lot of people get this idea that the goal when you're losing weight is to track your food. That's actually not the goal. That's a helpful means to get to the goal, but the actual goal is to eat the right amount of food for your body, right? So you can eat the right amount of food for your body without tracking your food, but you're much more likely to consistently eat the quote unquote right amount of food for your body if you're actually seeing it and measuring it and tracking it. See what I'm saying? We see a lot of clients fall into that mindset, so I wanted to address that first.
Yeah, well, a lot of times people will say, well, if I didn't track it, it didn't count.
That too.
And the truth is, I kind of alluded to this a little bit, but it definitely counts.
Yes.
And so if you're saying that to yourself, it's not a criticism, but it's really important that you're mindful of what the underlying belief is underneath it, which is most likely, I don't even know if I'm going to reach this goal. It seems too far away. It's really not that important, which is a very important conversation to have with yourself. Because if you're telling yourself, well, if I don't track, it doesn't really count, you're missing the point, which is you're choosing to eat food. Your body is tracking it, which is manifesting in when you step on the scale, it's not where you want it to be. Or when you put on your clothes, it's not where you want it to be. MyFitnessPal or not, that's happening.
Yeah, and people demonize MyFitnessPal.
Yeah, like, well, I didn't track it, so it didn't happen. It's like, no, it definitely happened, and it's not helpful to lie to yourself.
Yeah.
It's not a helpful truth, because it's not true.
Yeah.
And it's being able to work through the layers of, why am I choosing to eat this food? Why did I choose to eat it in that moment? What was I trying to get from it? And those are some things we're going to talk about in a moment here. But again, the second piece of this is understanding that it is giving you the education of what you're putting in your body, but it's also teaching you, when you track your food, it's also teaching you about nutrition. There's a really important tool that we can use, a really helpful tool that we can use to teach us about nutrition, to teach us nutrition facts. You want to hammer on that a little bit?
Well, so when it comes to learning your nutrition, this is really, really important. If you can't look at a plate and tell me what is on that plate, how many calories that plate consists of, how many ounces or portions of each item there are, then you might be lacking nutrition knowledge. You are lacking nutrition knowledge. Once you get to the point where you've tracked your food enough, you actually build what I call like a Rolodex in your mind, where you can look at food and know exactly how many calories it is. You can know how many grams of protein it is, and you know how that goes into your daily total. It becomes automatic. And that's where most people want to get to, but they just they have a little bit of a gap in their understanding of what it takes to get there. They just want it to feel automatic naturally, when that's actually something they've never really learned, right? So MyFitnessPal, again, going back, that's a tool to give you education on your nutrition, education on what your body actually needs, education on what a plate is made up of, so that you can get to the point where you can automatically and confidently eat well.
And to build off that, the way that you're using the tool, again, is teaching you what you're eating. If you go and say, oh, I want to have a cheeseburger today, and you look up on MyFitnessPal generic cheeseburger, right, which is a patty, a bun, a piece of cheese, you'll see that's 450 calories. And that will inform you, okay, that's how much I roughly ate. I need to eat 2,000 calories. Well, I still have 1,500 calories to go. So this actually really can help our relationship with food, because we start to see, oh, I don't have to fear a cheeseburger. I don't have to fear pasta, but maybe I need to cut back on my portions. And the other piece to that is it might actually help you make better decisions. I'll share this little story quick, but Lindsay and I had a client one time who, after every day of work, big CEO, had this company he was running, his way of kind of winding down was to sit and kind of do emails at his house, unwinding. And so what he would do is he would have a stack of like ham and cheese, and he would make roll-ups and eat mayonnaise, dip them in mayonnaise. And this was his habit for years. And when we worked with him, he's like, man, Brian, I looked up how many calories that was on MyFitnessPal. Blew me away. I was eating like 800 calories because of the mayonnaise and the cheese. He's like, that was so many calories. So he adjusted the portions, and he still had the habit, but he changed his behavior because he was educated on what he was putting in his body. Mm-hmm. So that's really what tracking does. Tracking isn't a way for you to judge yourself. Tracking isn't a frustration. Tracking is an educational tool.
Yes.
That's going to show you your behavior.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to show you your behavior, and it's going to educate you about nutrition. And once you start to do that, you start to see more of maybe some of the habits that aren't helpful. Maybe start to see, oh, I need to eat a little bit more protein because there's not a lot of protein in my diet. Mm-hmm. It should be a tool to help you improve your behavior rather than a judgment of how much you're failing. And I think that's kind of the piece that a lot of people get into is like, oh, well, I need to be more consistent with tracking. I don't really do it. That's because there's no purpose. Mm-hmm. There's no purpose. The purpose is to educate yourself, and the purpose might also be to really make sure you hit your target. So as we tie this down, before we get into how to make this shift into maybe a different way, Lindsay, who should be tracking their food? Like, who would benefit from, in this season, tracking their food?
Right. So we want to separate this out a little bit so you can figure out what category you fall into. Sometimes, for a small side note, but important side note, sometimes we get really, really frustrated with a tool, and we assume that the frustration means we should no longer use the tool because the tool is causing us too much pain. Be mindful of this. Just because you're frustrated, it's not the tool's fault, right? Your frustration is your own responsibility, and if you can work through that, the tool is going to be much more useful to you, right? And you can still use it and get better results because of it. So walk with me. There's a few people who should really consider continuing or starting to track their food. People with limited nutrition knowledge. So like we said, if you can't look at a plate and tell me exactly what's on it, then you probably need to keep tracking your food or start tracking your food because you have limited nutrition knowledge. Second person that should be considering tracking their food is somebody who's really hungry for success. They have a very intentional, important goal. They have something that they really want to hit, and that's within the physical realm of health and well-being. If you have a physical goal, whether it's to optimize your hormone health or to lose weight or to, let's say, run a half marathon, something that really is much more successful when you are tracking and paying attention to your nutrition, you should consider tracking your food. The third person who falls in this bucket of maybe should continue to or start tracking their food is someone who is really data driven. You love seeing data. It empowers you. It excites you. It makes you feel certainty and confidence because you can adjust or maneuver things based on the data you see. If that's genuinely like your personality style or your behavioral style, what you like to do, then having that data of your food is going to be extremely helpful and actually make this feel more fun, like a data-driven game that you get to adjust and control as desired. So those three people should really consider tracking their food and see the rest of this podcast as something to aspire to once your goal is hit, or you feel like you have all the nutrition knowledge you need and you want to shift into more mindful and intuitive eating.
And the good thing is if you do what we're going to talk about next while you're tracking food, when it's time to pivot away, when that tool no longer serves you, you're going to be far more successful. And if you can combine tracking with what we're going to talk about when it comes to intuitive eating and mindful eating, that's where the real recipe of long-term, we'll say healthy living comes into play.
Right. Now, where do we start here? If we're going to bridge out of this whole idea of tracking your food to make progress and lose weight, where do we go from here? We're going to bridge into what is called mindful eating. Mindful eating as a practice, something that you can implement in lieu of tracking your food that will still help you to make progress physically. Now, even if you've heard of mindful eating or you're familiar with the concept, we want you to almost wipe the slate clean a little bit so that you can see it through a new lens. The lens that we're looking through right now is how do you use mindful eating as a tool to help you make physical progress, get healthier, continue to lose a little bit of weight? How do you use this tool inside of that realm of life? Walk with us. Starting off, what is mindful eating?
So mindful eating is a practice of paying attention to the experience of eating, right? So we're becoming present. You can think of that as a practice of being present with food, being present when we're eating food, being present with ourselves in the experiences that we have around nutrition. That's very different than how a lot of us live.
Yeah.
You think, I got to go to the meeting, I just need a snack, I'm hungry. Or I'm sitting there late at night, I'm just going to eat chips, and then before you know it, you ate the whole bag. You're doing that because you're not present. I think it's really important to understand, like, you're doing that because you're not aware of the habit. Or you're aware that you're doing it, but you're not really aware of maybe the underlying emotions or thoughts that are driving you. And so in order for us to implement a strategy like mindful eating and see success still, we have to know what the steps are, right? So what are we actually talking about? Okay, so I know I need to pay attention to food, but what does that mean? Does that mean I just start looking at it all the time, right? No. What we want to start with is first, part one of the experience is starting to pay attention to your food. So you can think of that as when I'm at the restaurant, I intentionally think about what I am ordering. So I take a moment to pay attention to that. I might pay attention to the food that I see instead of just sitting around and kind of thinking about something else. Like if I'm thinking of driving, right? Obviously I don't want to look at the food, but I want to be able to think of being more present and engaged with what I'm eating. At a restaurant, that might be seeing the food, that might be just tasting it, right? Slowing down to taste it. One of the things I tell a lot of clients is if you eat 5 cookies, the only 2 cookies that really taste good are the first one and the last one, right? The first one, you're like, oh my God, it's so delicious, I want another. And you get a second one, you're like, that really wasn't as good as the first one. And you get a third one, you're like, I've already eaten 2 or 3, maybe as well have another. And before you know it, that last cookie is really the one where you really savor it. Like the last 2 bites, you're like, oh my God, I know this is the last one, I'm just going to savor it. We can do that with just 1 or 2 cookies by choosing to pay attention to it and taste it. And the last piece of paying attention to your food is just being able to slow down and chew it, right? So I'm fully attentive to what I'm eating and how I'm eating. So that'd be the first place to really build awareness and start paying attention.
Yeah, you'd be surprised of how many little details you can pick up on if you just pay attention when you're eating versus multitask when you're eating. We'll cover a specific practice you can do later, but you'll notice the textures you've never noticed. You'll notice that it has way more flavor than you probably thought it did, or maybe the smell is more strong or more prevalent than when you're rushing through it. It's even like a cup of coffee is a really good example. When you smell it and taste it and slowly like sip on it, it's completely different than if you're chugging coffee, right? Especially a little more like iced coffee. Most people don't chug hot coffee. Anyway, I digress. So pay attention to your food is kind of the first step for success if you're going to start implementing mindful eating. The second, which Brian alluded to a little bit, is if you want to eat mindfully, you have to pay attention to your pace. Mm-hmm. So slowing down when you eat is not only helpful for some of the other elements of success that we'll talk about in a second, it's also helpful for how your body actually does digest your food. A lot of times you feel really bloated after you eat, not just because you're sensitive to the food. That might not be the case at all. A lot of times it's actually because you're eating way too big of bites. You're not taking the time to chew, and or you're eating really, really fast. So it hits your stomach quickly, and then your body doesn't digest it and you get more gas around it. So then you feel bloated. So a lot of times, even if you just slow down and eat smaller bites and actually chew, your body responds a lot better to the food you eat. Mm-hmm. So that's more of a fun side fact.
Well, it also gives you so you think about the time it takes for your brain and your stomach to connect. The food going slower down, you taking your time allows you to actually be more full, right? So that's an important piece of slowing down. It's like you're just rushing to the next meal, next bite. It's like, You have to give your body time to actually become aware of what's inside of it, right? Just being able to slow down
Mm-hmm.
helps you not overeat, right? You can do with one plate what you could do with two because you just ate slower.
Mm-hmm. Yep, which is really that third element of mindful eating, which is paying attention to your body's cues. You might have hunger cues before you eat, and then there's going to be fullness cues as you're eating. And we're going to do a whole podcast in depth on listening to your hunger and fullness cues. But for now, we're going to focus mostly on fullness cues because we're talking about the process of eating, right? So your body is built to tell you when you're getting full. And it tells you that by starting to feel a sensation of fullness, right? Like volume being taken up in your stomach. So that's one cue, is you start to physically feel like there's a greater volume of food in your body, which is where pace really helps. You also will stop having that feeling of hollowness or rumbling in your stomach, right? Like that kind of quiets down. When you're getting full, you also innately, unintentionally, start to slow down when you're getting full. You'll notice that, like, food stays on your plate a little longer. You'll unintentionally just start kind of putting your fork down. That's your body's physical way of telling you, like, hey, you're getting full. Slow down a little bit, chill out. And if you also start to feel a sense of disinterest, or maybe the opposite, another way of saying that might be satisfaction, right? You're starting to feel like, okay, that was good. You're not like desiring to take that next bite. That's also your body's way of cueing you that you're starting to get full.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can see how if you don't have that second step, was it second step? Yeah, second step around pace locked in, all those hunger cues and fullness cues would be ignored, right? If you eat your whole plate in 2 minutes, you're not going to notice that you slowed down, right? You're not going to notice that you have more food in your body. You're not going to notice any of those things. So if you slow down your pace because you're mindfully eating, then you're going to be much more aware of your fullness cues, which is going to, again, keep you from overeating, right? Which is where we go the opposite direction of our goals when we overeat, overdo it.
And so as we're kind of looking at it, so I need to start paying attention to the food I'm eating. Again, that might be paying attention to what I'm eating. That might be paying attention to the sensations around it, the pace at which I'm eating, allowing my body to actually process it and realize that I'm putting food into it, the cues that you have around fullness. And then the last piece we want to start to pay attention to is just some of our thoughts or sensations or emotions around it, right? So sometimes if we think a food is good or bad, we'll tend to judge ourselves and we'll eat it really fast, or we'll hide it. Or even if you think about the sensations you have with food, it might be motivated by boredom or stress. And so we want to stay curious, like asking yourself curiosity-based questions. And this comes from one of our good friends, Sarah Best Nutrition. She teaches about mindful eating. And so one of the things she says is curiosity over judgment. Very important when you're building a habit of, or maybe a practice rather, of being mindful with food. We want to start being present. And then when we feel the desire to eat, or we feel the desire to reach for the next, we'll say, cookie or the next slice of pizza, we want to ask ourselves a curiosity-based question, which is, what am I actually seeking? Do I really need the food, or am I just looking for a little bit of variety? Is this going to make me feel full, or am I seeking something else other than the feeling of fullness? Am I doing this because I'm stressed? Am I doing this because I'm anxious? Maybe another question is, what do I need right now? So being able to interocept, observe our body, observe how we're feeling, and then the next step is become mindful of our thoughts and what we're actually experiencing in that moment, helps us to build that habit of being more present with not just the food, but with ourselves. If we struggle to be disciplined with food, it's really that we struggle to be present with what we want, right? We're struggling to advocate for our goals or take that disciplined next step. And that might be because we're having so much fun, right? It's not always bad. Sometimes food is a great celebration and a happy time. It's delicious, right? There's positive things too, but we still want to be able to gauge, how can I stick to my intention with nutrition? How can I eat healthier? How can I make better choices? And how can I start to build a relationship with food that allows me to give my body what it needs without me having to track it? which is really the ultimate goal.
Now, if this all has you thinking and you want to test this, you want to start working on it, here's a simple test for yourself. Here is something that you can implement today. On your next meal, take these next 5 steps. First, sit with the food in the least distracting environment possible. I would carve out at least 7 minutes, if not 10, to actually eat your meal, but create an environment where you can be mindful. Okay, that's your first step. Second step is going to be engage your senses. All of your senses. So first, see your food, smell your food, use your hands, look at yourself picking up the food, taste the food, chew the food, notice the textures, the different flavors, engage all of your senses when you're eating your food. And then third, really savor each bite. So maybe consider putting down your fork at each bite. Do whatever you can to slow down and savor it as that step 3. Step 4, as you're eating, listen to your body. Practice listening to your body. It's not going to speak to you. You have to pay attention to some of the cues we talked about today, right? Notice the food actually traveling down your body. Notice the volume, right? Notice your hunger starting to die down.
And you can think about it. If you haven't had a conversation with someone in a long time, sometimes it's really awkward. So if you haven't listened to your body, and you don't know what that really feels like, it might take you a little bit of time to observe what it feels like to be hungry or what it feels like to be full. So just tune in, right?
Yeah.
Think that it's like there's a layer of awareness or a layer of understanding that comes with this. So just being able to sit and observe, it's like, what am I observing? Who knows, right? Wherever you're at, you're going to see something.
Yeah, it's like when you're listening to music. So we both come from musical families. And I remember as a kid, my dad would be like, do you hear the bass? Do you hear the guitar? Do you hear that harmony? And at first you're like, I just hear music. I don't know. But then over time, as you practice, you train your ear, right? Like you start to differentiate between those different instruments or harmonies.
That's why we are married.
Yes.
I'll be driving down the road and be like, do you hear that guitar?
So when you're listening, when you're trying to listen to your body, you're going to be able to start pulling apart those different pieces of the symphony.
Yeah.
For a good little parallel there. But then lastly, just be curious, right? Try not to judge the food. Try not to judge yourself. Try to be mindful of the thoughts going through your head and just think, okay, what am I hearing? Like ask a lot of what questions, not like why, or making frustrated statements to yourself like, gosh, this is so hard, blah, blah, blah. Like try to just be curious. Okay, what am I experiencing? How could this be helpful in the future? Like just start thinking more curiously, and that's going to be your 5th step to really test out this mindful eating practice.
I want to tie this down with a short little story to kind of cue you into what this might feel like, because this all seems very big. And it's a daily practice, right? It's a practice. So start with learning to sit with yourself, learning to engage with the senses, which really means become present. Savor the food, taste it, enjoy it, listen to your body, stay curious. Like these are all very helpful things, but at first it might feel really uncomfortable. I remember when I first started meditating, one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to challenge myself to meditate in public. Very uncomfortable, because if you have a history of worrying if people are judging you, it's very uncomfortable to sit like this in an open space where people can walk by. And so the whole time I remember sitting there meditating and being like, people are judging me. This is so weird. They're definitely thinking I'm strange. Someone's going to come steal all my stuff. Like I had all these thoughts. And then when I opened my eyes, there was no one around. Like even though I was sitting in a public park, there was no one there. So the point is, the curiosity in the practice is being able to see how much of your thoughts and emotions are just stories, right? They're just sensations that usually aren't true. And so if we can learn how to practice this with food, it becomes a practice that will reshape a lot of our lives. And when you combine this with the right approach to your nutrition, that's how you really do this and say, hey, I don't need to track my food because I've learned to listen to my body, give it what it needs, and make this a successful way of living rather than just a diet that I'm trying for a little bit.
And if you don't fall in any of those 3 buckets that we mentioned earlier, those people that maybe should really consider continuing to track their food, which again, those were people who have a really clear goal that they're really hungry for, they're data driven, or they're somebody who just is really lacking nutrition knowledge. If you don't fall in any of those buckets, you've already accomplished your goals. Like, you don't necessarily have any pertinent, strong physical goals that you want to be calculated towards, then great. Start to implement some mindful eating and see how it goes. Right? Start to pay attention to your body, listen to yourself, and it's going to give you so much more confidence as you move forward that you can maintain the results you've created.
And what's great, can I add this one little piece?
Sure.
If you do the first part with the second part, not only are results going to get better, results will be easier, and they'll stay longer too.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see those two as, hey, well, I'm tracking my food and I'm becoming mindful.
Yes.
Or you can do them both in unison, and I thought it was really important to tie that.
Totally. No, that's absolutely true. Now, as we've gone through this podcast, you've probably had a lot of ideas and thoughts come up. I know you're going to want to test some of this, but also you might want to dive a little bit deeper into any of the topics we discussed around hunger cues, fullness cues, emotional eating, stress eating, some of those things we've kind of alluded to. Now, we are actually hosting a food freedom masterclass this week when this podcast launches and goes out. If you want to be a part of that, it's free for our communities. We're putting it on this week, and all the details for it are going to be in the show notes below, whether you're on YouTube or on podcasts. So sign up for that. And even if you can't come live, sign up, get the recording in your inbox, and that way you can really build on this knowledge that you've gained even just throughout this podcast. But we'd love to see you and actually meet you in person because we'll be live on Zoom.
Mm-hmm. My understanding, and obviously we'll correct it in the show notes, is it's March 21st. We're hosting the masterclass. So that just give you a little context. Show up. We'd love to see you. Sign up. And it's going to be a really helpful way to start kind of pulling these pieces together.
Mm-hmm. But all in all, we hope that this has been helpful and you can go out, use this information to your best and its best, and conquer your day.
Cheers.